Hello, I hope you're all doing well tonight. I've made a video for you explaining the new concepts for this week of validity and soundness. So with that being said, let's jump right into our lecture. I've made a PowerPoint and I'll share my screen now. Begin the slideshow. When we talk about valid and sound arguments, we're talking about properties that make reasoning good or bad. You may have heard many of these terms in ordinary language already, but in logic they have a little bit more specialized of a meaning. And I'll be happy to explain that to you in the course of this lecture. In watching this video, I'm assuming that you've read pages 1 through 18 of the text that I assigned called For All X. This is a free open source logic textbook from the University of Calgary. In this class, we'll be thinking deeply about the nature of legal argumentation. And so it's in our interest to ask the preliminary question, what's an argument? An argument is a sentence or an arrangement of sentences which taken together imply or entail another sentence called a conclusion. When sentences have these certain good-making features, they make it reasonable for you to believe the conclusion. And so we'll study these things later. I'll explicate these concepts later. For now, let's just look at a paradigm example of an argument. Here I've put up on the slide, if it's raining on the other side of town, we won't go to the picnic. It's raining on the other side of town, so we won't go to the picnic. This is an argument. Now, we can further analyze the anatomy of the argument as follows. You'll notice that now I've put two of the sentences in red. These two red sentences are what we call the premises of an argument. And when taken together, they imply the green sentence. The green sentence is called the conclusion. So far, so good, I hope. There is a little bit of a wrinkle if you've done the reading. Here's what the text says. The text says that an argument is any collection of premises together with a conclusion. Let's look at our arguments again. What makes it the case that certain sentences are premises while another sentence is the conclusion? If you were to meet someone who wasn't quite well and they just began idly babbling to you about whatever, it seems to me that what they would be saying would not actually be an argument at all. Suppose that you met someone on the street who, with a crazed look in their eye, told you red is red, blue is blue, therefore Joe Biden will win the next presidential election in America. Well, this is obviously silly, but if you look at the definition of an argument here, it's a collection of premises together with a conclusion. This person that I'm imagining has given you premises, red is red, blue is blue, and they've given you a conclusion, right? Therefore, Joe Biden will be the next president, or he'll win the next election, I should say. And yet it seems sort of odd to think of that as an argument because the premises don't even make it reasonable for you to think at all that Joe Biden might be the next president. You know, the self-identity of color properties has absolutely nothing to do with the next presidential election. And so it seems to me that an argument actually is a collection of premises taken with a conclusion that is at least presented to you as making it reasonable to accept a conclusion. So an argument is not just this random collection of sentences. Whenever somebody gives you an argument, they smuggle along with it this claim that you ought to, on the basis of or because of the premises, accept the conclusion. That's what it is to be an argument. It's to have these premises presented along with the conclusion, but there's this other further claim that because of the premises, you ought to, in some sense of the term ought, accept the conclusion. Now, it's not the case that for anything that functions as a sentence grammatically, that it could be part of an argument. In fact, there's only one kind of sentence that can function as a premise or a part of an argument. Recall maybe elementary grammar, where you learned about perhaps 4 different kinds of sentences. We have imperative sentences, interrogative sentences, exclamatory sentences, and then lastly, our preferred kind of sentence here, the assertoric or declarative or indicative, I think, sentence. The imperative sentence is a command usually, right? Things like shut the door, shut up, don't do that, put that down. As a new parent, I find myself issuing imperatives to my daughter all the time. There are interrogative sentences, which are just simply put questions. How was it? Who was there? How was the weather? Next, you have kind of exclamations like ouch, or, well, expletives, right? Things of that nature. I don't need to actually say any of those. You know what they are. And then the last kind of sentence are these truth functional, declarative, assertoric, and indicative sentences. Things like, it was nice outside today, or today was Mother's Day, yesterday was Mother's Day, things of that sort. So only this last kind of sentence, only sentence type 4, the assertoric, declarative, or indicative sentence, can be the kind of thing that functions as a premise in an argument. And a good test for you to figure out whether something can be part of an argument or not is to ask yourself the question, is this sentence capable of being true or false? Think again of the imperative, shut the door. It doesn't seem to me that something like shut the door is capable of being true or false. Likewise with an interrogative. How was it? This question is not the kind of thing that's capable of being true or false. Likewise, ouch, as an exclamatory sentence, is not the kind of thing that's capable of being true or false. But an assertoric sentence like, my sweatshirt is black, that is a sentence that's capable of being true or false, and therefore it's the kind of thing that could function as a premise or the conclusion of an argument. But this might actually spell out a little bit of a puzzle for us, and so I've reserved a special, intriguing challenge for us to think through at the very end. And I might just leave us with a little bit of a cliffhanger as we go into the next video, just to create some suspense. Here, let's see about the drastic consequences that could happen if we were to try to use a non-truth functional sentence, something other than a declarative sentence, as a premise in an argument. Consider this argument. If you don't make the sandwiches, we won't go to the picnic. Premise 2 says, make the sandwiches. Conclusion, therefore, we won't go to the picnic. Well, as you can see, when we use something other than a declarative sentence as a premise, we can't find a good route to get from this premise 1 down to the conclusion. We've already seen what it takes for us to get from the premise to the conclusion. We need a connecting premise such as the one we see here. In this argument, we need something like, you won't make the sandwiches. And if it's the case that you won't make the sandwiches, then we won't go to the picnic. But here, an imperative sentence just won't do the trick, will it? We need a declarative sentence. Likewise with the interrogative sentence. If you make the sandwiches, if you don't make the sandwiches, we won't go to the picnic. Will you make the sandwiches? Premise 2 is not the sort of thing we need to go from premise 1 to the conclusion. Therefore, we won't go to the picnic. And so you can kind of see why only a truth functional sentence, only a declarative sentence, is the kind of thing to which you could appeal as a premise in an argument. Now, the text also emphasizes other curiosities, such as the fact that when ordinary people talk to you and they present arguments, conclusions needn't be the final sentence that's shown. Here, in all these examples I've shown you, the conclusion happens to be the very last sentence that we see. But when you just converse casually with somebody else, the conclusion could appear virtually anywhere in the conversation. And so from one of the exercises from the reading, you could note this peculiar feature of the way people talk. There are other clues about what the conclusion could be. Some of these clues involve the use of certain words, such as so, or hence, or therefore. But sometimes these conclusory terms are just suppressed altogether, which makes figuring out the conclusion quite difficult. So let's look at these exercises together. The first sentence is, it's sunny. Second sentence is, so I should take my sunglasses. This is an argument. It's one with a suppressed premise. If it's sunny, I should take my sunglasses, but in ordinary action, it's quite ordinary to just suppress that premise and go with something like this. The conclusion here is, so I should take my sunglasses. That's the conclusion of our argument. But look at this second argument. It must have been sunny. I did wear my sunglasses after all. Here, it must have been sunny appears to be the conclusion of an argument, even though it's the first sentence. And the premise that supports our conclusion is, I did wear my sunglasses. Now, in argument 3, it looks like the conclusion has been parked at the end of this collection of sentences again. Let's read through it together. No one but you has had their hands in the cookie jar, and the scene of the crime is littered with cookie crumbs. Insert the word therefore. You're the culprit. But we only find that out when we think about what this sentence, you're the culprit, is doing in this argument. Oops. And in argument 4, looks like the conclusion is parked somewhere in the middle. First sentence is, Miss Scarlett and Professor Plum were in the study at the time of the murder. Second sentence, Reverend Green had the candlestick in the ballroom, and we know there's no blood on his hands. Hence, there's our conclusory language. Colonel Mustard did it in the kitchen with the lead pipe. Recall, after all, the gun had not been fired. This final sentence, recall after all that the gun had not been fired, looks to be an additional premise. And so the conclusion can appear anywhere in this collection of sentences that's presented to you. You just have to do some work sometimes to figure out which of these sentences actually is the conclusion. I'd like to now talk about 2 special features of an argument that is of particular interest to logicians and philosophers alike. I'll call these good-making features of an argument. Different items that we use in our daily life have good-making features. A good-making feature of a knife, for instance, is its ability to cut things. I recently ordered a product from Amazon called Aptasia X. I use it for my aquarium, and this product kills a certain kind of pest anemone that crops up in my aquarium. A good-making feature of Aptasia X is if it kills the Aptasia like I want it to do. So lots of things have good-making features, and arguments have them too. And in what follows, what I'll tell you about are 2 particular good-making features of an argument. The first of these good-making features is called validity. As I'll be using the term today, validity is the property of an argument in which the conclusion must be true if the premises are true. The word if is perhaps the most important word in this sentence. And I'm going to say it again because this is one of the most difficult things to learn for the first time. But you know what? Many of you are philosophy majors in this class, and so you're antecedently familiar. But for those who are unfamiliar, let's read it one more time. Validity is the property of an argument in which the conclusion must be true if the premises are true. Let's look at this argument that I've listed here. If the next card is a spade, it can also be a club. The next card is a spade. Conclusion, it can't be a club. Now let's identify what our premises are here. Well, I've marked it quite nicely for you with a C, so you know that the conclusion is that which follows from the premise here. However, I've also included some conclusory language to make it even easier, right? From these premises, our premises appear to be sentences 1 and 2. And if 1 and 2 are both true, then it's impossible for C to be false. It's another way of saying, if 1 and 2 are true, then the conclusion must be true as well. Or C must be true if the premises are true. So this argument has one attractive feature, which is that it's a valid argument. Now, in ordinary language, if you just go about and kind of chronicle the way people use the term valid argument, a lot of people mean something a little bit sloppier, and which we'll be ignoring in this class. Sometimes people will say your argument is invalid, and they just mean your argument's bad in some way, in some vague, general, and undefined way, your argument is bad. And you see memes like this. Likewise, I've heard people talk about feelings being valid or results being valid, things of that nature. But in this class, we'll have a more narrow and restricted scope when we use the term valid. As I'll be using the term valid in this class, I'll just be referring to the property of an argument in which the conclusion must be true if the premises are true. Again, look at the premises and note how C cannot be false if 1 and 2 are true. At least not with what we know about our deck of cards, right? Something can't be both a club and a spade at the same time in a standard deck of cards. Now, even though this is a pretty nice feature of an argument, if you can find a valid argument, sometimes premises can be false. Even when an argument has false premises, an argument can still have this good property of validity. Let's look at this argument now to see an example of this. If the next card is a spade, it can't also be a club. The next card is a spade, so it can't be a club. Now let's assume that premise 2 is in fact false. The next card isn't a spade at all, as premise 2 says. In fact, the next card is the Queen of Hearts. Even though premise 2 is false in this argument, the argument is still valid. Why is that? Because validity is the property in which the conclusion of an argument must be true if the premises are true. If the premises were both true, then the conclusion must follow from them. Now here, the premises aren't true, but if they were, the conclusion would follow. And so even though this argument isn't the best possible argument, it still does have at least one thing going for it, right? It still has one good-making feature. It has the property in which the conclusion of this argument must be true if the premises are true. Now, of course, the premises aren't all true because the next card will be a Queen of Hearts in the scenario we're imagining. But it still has the property of validity. All we're concerned with when we talk about validity is this relationship between the premises and the conclusion. And you might be thinking at this point, well, okay, I can see how a valid argument is better than no argument at all. It's not the worst possible thing that could happen, but it still doesn't seem to be the gold standard of argumentation. You'd be exactly right. Now we're going to talk about a new concept, a new good-making feature of an argument called soundness. Sound arguments are valid arguments in which all the premises are true. So not only does a sound argument have this special relationship between premises and conclusion in which, if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true as well. A sound argument has the added benefit of having all true premises. So valid arguments describe one standard of goodness for an argument. Sound arguments take things to the next level. They include the constraint that all premises of the argument be true. Let's imagine a sound argument now. Premise 1, if the next card is a spade, it can't also be a club. Premise 2, the next card is a spade. Conclusion, so it can't also be a club. Well, it looks valid. We've already established that from the previous example. If 1 and 2 are true, then the conclusion must also be the case. Now let's imagine that the next card is in fact a Queen of Spades. Here, it looks like our argument is sound because all premises are true And there's this special relationship between the premises and the conclusion, in which, if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true as well. Let's practice a little bit with some of these exercises from the textbook. The first example is, Socrates is a man, and all men are carrots. Therefore, Socrates is a carrot. Well, this is crazy. Of course, all men are carrots. But let's think about it. There does seem to be a special relationship between these premises and the conclusion. It doesn't seem like it's possible for the conclusion to be false if the premises are true. And so this argument is actually valid because the conclusion at least follows from the premises. Now, it's not sound because, of course, it's crazy that all men are carrots, but the argument at least has this thing going for it, that if 1 and 2 are true, then Socrates is a carrot. If. Let's look at the second example. Either Abe Lincoln was born in Illinois or he was once president. Abe Lincoln was never president. Therefore, Abe Lincoln was born in Illinois. To me, this argument looks valid again. And why is it valid? Because if 1 and 2 are true, assuming something special about the term or, which I don't really need to get into right now, but if 1 and 2 are true here, then this conclusion must follow from the premises. Now, is the argument sound? Is it the best possible argument, and are all the premises true? Well, when I was driving through Kentucky, I believe I saw a billboard that said the birthplace of Lincoln. And so I'm tempted to think that this argument is unsound because it has a false premise. I don't think, well, I need to think about this more. But Abe Lincoln was not born in Illinois. I know this much. He was born in Kentucky. And so something has gone wrong with the argument, right? Something's gone wrong. And so I'm to say the argument would be unsound. Let's look at number 3. If I pull the trigger, Abe Lincoln will die. I do not pull the trigger. Conclusion, Abe Lincoln will not die. Well, here it looks like it is possible for the conclusion to be true, or the conclusion to be false, even if the premises are true. Abe Lincoln might die from natural causes, for instance. And so if you can find a counterexample, it's good evidence that the premises don't entail the conclusion, which is to say, even if the premises were true, the conclusion could be false. And so since there isn't this special relationship between the premises and the conclusion, I think we should say this argument is invalid. Now, what about this third example? Now, the premises are up here at the top. The conclusion is down here at the bottom because of pagination. Let's look at the first premise. Abe Lincoln was either from France or from Luxembourg. Abe Lincoln was not from Luxembourg. Conclusion, Abe Lincoln was from France. Well, if 1 and 2 are true, and or restricts all possible options here, then it looks like the conclusion must be true as well. And since there's this special relationship between premises and conclusion, it looks to me that the argument is valid. But of course, Abraham Lincoln was not from France or from Luxembourg. There are more options than that, and so premise 1 is false, right? Okay. Now, if the world ends today, we're moving on to the next example now. If the world ends today, then I will not need to get up tomorrow morning. But I will need to get up tomorrow morning. So the world won't end today. That seems to me to be valid as well. Because if 1 and 2 are both true, it's not possible for the conclusion to be false. Let's look at this last example. Joe is now 19 years old. Premise 2, Joe is now 87 years old. Conclusion, Bob is now 20 years old. Well, I have no way of knowing whether these premises are true or not. There might be a person named Joe to whom this argument refers, who is in fact 19 years old right now. There might be a different person named Joe who's now 87, and it might be true that Bob, whoever that is now 20. But I can tell you this, There isn't the right sort of relationship between the premises and the conclusion. The conclusion doesn't follow from the premises. It's not entailed by the premises, which is to say, even if the premises were true, the conclusion could still be false because the conclusion does not depend on anything contained in premises 1 or 2, right? And so this argument is invalid because the conclusion does not follow from the premises. Perhaps we can sort of test our knowledge of these concepts by kind of looking over here, something I've recently posted to our Carmen page. Let me share my screen so we can kind of see what I'm talking about. This is optional for you to do, but if you find it helpful, you might like to click through some of the resources I've posted here. Here's our course page. Here is a link that I've put here called Optional Practice for Validity and Soundness. I'm just going to click on this and go through it with you because I like this quiz a good deal. All right. Let's test our knowledge of the concepts we've just learned with a short quiz. A sound argument is a valid deductive argument with true premises. Notice I haven't really told you much about what a deductive argument is, but it's the kind of argument I've shown you, with premises arranged in such a way that the conclusion is supposed to follow from these. It's presented that way, at least. So let's look at this question again. A sound argument is a valid deductive argument with true premises. Well, that's just the definition of a sound argument. And so this is true. Okay, let's look at the second question. A deductive argument cannot be both valid and unsound. That's completely false, because unsound arguments are very often valid. Remember that a valid argument is just one in which there's this special relationship between the premises and the conclusion, in which the conclusion must be true if the premises are. But sometimes the premises are false. When an argument has false premise, it's unsound. But sometimes valid arguments can have false premises. We just saw an example of that in my own slides. And so this is false. Question 3. All valid deductive arguments are sound arguments. This is completely false because a valid deductive argument might still have a false premise. Question 4. A deductive argument can be either valid or invalid and still have true premises. A deductive argument can be either valid or invalid and still have true premises. Of course. When the conclusion of a deductive argument is true, the argument must be sound. Well, no, because an invalid argument might still have a true conclusion. You might say, my name is Gerald, my name is Tom, therefore I'm teaching the class right now. It's true that I'm teaching the class right now. It's supposed to be the conclusion of the argument, but the premises were completely false. My name's Donnie. Look at question 6. When the premises of a deductive argument are true, the conclusion is always true as well. That's false because what if the argument was invalid? What if you had red is red, blue is blue, therefore my name is Donnie? In that case, you would have true premises and a true conclusion. So perhaps it's not the best example, but let's think of a different way in which we might express this thought. Red is red, blue is blue, therefore my name's Gerald. Well, there, the premises were true, of course, but the conclusion was false because the argument's invalid. Question 6 is false if you didn't see it. If a deductive argument is sound, then the conclusion must be true. That's correct. If the premises are true, And if the conclusion must be true if the premises are, then the conclusion must be true as well. So sound arguments always have true conclusions. Question 8. A deductive argument could have a false premise and still be sound. That goes against everything that we've just talked about. A sound argument is a valid argument with all true premises. Question 9. In a valid deductive argument, the conclusion could be true or false. That's correct. If the premises are false, then even if the argument's valid, the argument would have a false conclusion. But recall that, if you had true premises and the argument was valid, then the conclusion would be true as well. It would also be sound, but sound arguments are valid. And so 9, I think, is true. Question 10. An invalid deductive argument could have all true statements in it. That seems right to me. Red is red, blue is blue, my name is Donnie. Red is red, blue is blue, therefore my name is Donnie. That looks like an invalid deductive argument, and it has all true statements. So if you're confused about this, what I would recommend doing is just doing the quiz by yourself. Take it slow. Look at every question in isolation. And then what you can do is try to form what the arguments would look like. Question 10, I tried to form an invalid argument that has all true statements in it. Red is red, blue is blue, therefore, my name is Donnie. All of those statements seem true, and yet the argument seems invalid because the conclusion, my name is Donnie, wouldn't follow from the premises red is red or blue is blue. Okay, so that's just there for your benefit. I'd like to finish this lecture today by looking back at something I mentioned earlier, a little bit of a preliminary puzzle for you about the possibility of legal reasoning. I like to do this every semester because I think it's just interesting, but let me see what you think about this. So I mentioned earlier, the only kinds of sentences that can function in an argument as premises are these truth functional sentences, declarative sentences, such as, my name is Donnie. The sky appears blue. My front door is locked. Things of that nature. In contrast, we can't have other kinds of sentences function as premises of arguments. Remember the 3 no-goes, if you will. There are the interrogative sentences, such as questions. Questions like, what will I wear tomorrow? When will I eat breakfast? Things of that nature. There are imperatives like, don't do it, and shut the door. Those are inapt. Those cannot be used in arguments either. And lastly, there are kind of exclamations like, ouch, or crap. Those cannot be premises in an argument. Only the truth functional declarative sentences, my name is Donnie, only that can be used in an argument. But you might be puzzled then by what legal reasoning could be, right? A law to me seems like it's an imperative. Think of the 10 Commandments, for instance, as a famous example of imperatives that are law-like. Don't commit murder. Don't commit adultery. Don't steal. Don't covet. Those look like imperatives to me. And yet legal reasoning, you might think, involves using the laws as premises in arguments, right? How else can we figure out that a particular defendant committed a crime if we don't tie facts from his particular case to a law? Let's look at the state of Ohio, particularly in the way in which it defines arson. It says in this portion of the state statute that defines arson, no person by means of fire or explosion shall knowingly do any of the following: cause or create a substantial risk of physical harm to another, to any property of another without the other person's consent. 2, cause or create a substantial risk of physical harm to any property of the offender or another with purpose to defraud. It goes on for much longer than what I've put on the screen here, but you've seen the basic structure of the law here, right? No person by means of fire or explosion shall knowingly do any of the following. It seems very much like the Ten Commandments, a paradigmatic imperative. And so how is legal reasoning possible? Think about what the legal reasoning would look like in a particular case. Here's an argument that's kind of hokey that I've put on the board. Some of this is the text of the law we just read. So premise one involves the text of the law we just read. No person shall, by means of fire or explosion, ... ellipses, cause physical harm to the property of another without the other person's consent. John Smith, let's say in premise two, caused physical harm to the property of another without the other person's consent. Conclusion, John Smith committed arson. Well, something funny has gone wrong in this argument, right? What's funny about it? Well, for one thing, it looks like premise one is an imperative. That's one of the things it has going wrong. It looks like premise one is not the kind of thing that we're allowed to use as a premise as an argument, right? The argument I've just given you is functionally equivalent to the argument in red down here. Do not, thou shalt not, do not, by means of fire or explosion, cause physical harm to the property of another without the other person's consent. John Smith caused physical harm to the property of another without the other person's consent. Conclusion, John Smith committed arson. So laws appear to be imperative in form, at least the criminal laws do. And yet we've already seen that an argument needs to involve a certain kind of truth functional sentence called a declarative sentence. And so, how is legal reasoning even possible? In the style of 1950s dramas, I'm going to leave you with a cliffhanger here. I'd like for you to think about this a little bit as you go on and watch the next video, which I'll post tomorrow. For now, I want you to struggle with this. How would legal reasoning be possible if the laws are imperatives and we're supposed to be using these truth functional sentences in reasoning? I'll leave you with that, and perhaps I'll resolve the question for you when we come back together next time. So have a nice rest of your evening, and I'll post the next video tomorrow night. Thanks for your time.